Hello students, this is the first module that deals with plants. This is module 5.5.1, Kingdom Plantae. And one of the things that we would first like to consider are where did plants come from? Who were the ancestors of plants? And we know that it was an algae. Chlorophyta is one group of algae, and this is a pretty general group. There's a more specific group, but this will do for Bio 101. So Chlorophyta is going to be the group that we attribute to being the ancestors of plants. They are members of Kingdom Protista. This is what they look like up in the upper left. At least some of them look like this. And the evidence which supports the Chlorophyta as ancestors of plants is that they have the same pigments, chlorophyll A and B. You can recall when we did thin layer chromatography when we were studying photosynthesis, and you actually saw chlorophyll A and B. They have the same life cycle, alternation of generations. We're going to learn about that a little bit later. And there are several other features. They both have cell walls of cellulose, and they both store energy as starch. And so these four features really tell us that plants are closely related to the Chlorophyta. And if we consider plant evolution, the previous slide tells us what we see here. Number one, that plants originated in water from algae, and that it was the primitive green algae Chlorophyta that gave rise to the first plants that made the transition from water to land. One thing that is of interest is how photosynthesis changed the earth and the environment. Initially, there was no oxygen in the ancient atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, oxygen built up until currently there's about 21% of the atmosphere that is oxygen. With this oxygen, this allowed several changes. One, it allowed oxygen to serve as a final electron acceptor in cellular respiration, and also oxygen provided an ozone layer. Ozone is O3. The oxygen we breathe is O2. Now, ozone in the upper atmosphere serves as a shield that blocks ultraviolet radiation from coming down and damaging life on the surface of the planet. O3, or ozone, down here in the lower atmosphere is a pollutant. It's very irritating. Now, the way that plants evolved is there were large inland seas, and the water levels fluctuated up and down, up and down. And those algae that were best able to withstand this by developing traits that allowed independence from water, they were the most successful lineage in that particular environment. And as a consequence, this led to terrestrial plants. Now, there are a number of challenges that faced these plants, or these algae, these protoplants, making the change from water to land. And I've just listed four of those challenges here. It's not meant to be completely comprehensive. Number one is the obvious one, desiccation, which is drying out. Notice the spelling of desiccation, one S, two C's. Transportation of fluids. A plant or an algae that lives in water has, each of its cells has access to whatever's dissolved in the water, but in the air, a terrestrial plant doesn't have that same advantage. It must have a more sophisticated internal transportation system. Also, physical buoyancy. Water is something like 820 times denser than air. And if you've ever seen what they call pond silk, a kind of very filamentous algae, and you take it out of the water, it just kind of collapses on itself. And so this is because the plant or the algae itself lacks support. And so plants that were going to leave the more dense medium of water for the less dense medium of air also had to develop a way to physically support their body. And a fourth challenge that I've listed here is reproduction. In water, the gametes, especially the male gametes, which are typically the motile or mobile gamete as opposed to the female, it can just simply swim through the water for algae, but a land plant doesn't have that ability. Its sperm can't swim through the air, and so something had to change. An adaptation had to be developed. Also, in terrestrial plants, the little embryo can easily dry out, and this is also a problem. To address these challenges, plants underwent a number of adaptations, and I'm going to list some of these adaptations. There's not a one-to-one correspondence with the challenges, although it might seem like it at first. Certainly one important adaptation was the development of a non-living, waxy secreted layer called the cuticle. Now, it's not cellular, but it's secreted by the cells, and typically when we make a prepared slide, the organic solvents will wash it away. So if we look down here in the lower left, you can see the cuticle is just like this goop that is secreted there, and it makes the cells waterproof and airtight. If you have an airtight perimeter, you have to have a way to allow air in for gaseous exchange, and so plants also had to develop stomates or leaf pores, and they allow this gaseous exchange. And here in the center, we can see a single stomate. If we look over here at the right, this is actually a section through a leaf of a terrestrial plant, and I just threw this in. We're not going to learn the histology or the names of the parts here seen under a microscope, but on the bottom there are these, they label it as stoma, and stoma is the same as stomates, and so leaf pores are present there. Another adaptation was that of vascular tissue. Vascular means like vessels, and so in humans, vascular tissues would be our blood vessels. In plants, the vascular tissue consists of two types of tissue called xylem and phloem. You should know their names, and you should know their major functions. They're both just tubular elements that run through the plant body and transport things. Xylem transports water and has the additional function of providing support. A botanist would call wood secondary xylem. Not that you need to remember that, but it's just a technical term for wood. Now, non-woody plants also have xylem that helps provide support. Think of like the fibers in a stalk of celery, stuff like that. The second type of vascular tissue is called phloem. Phloem transports food, and so you should exaggerate that pronunciation to remember that. The form that food takes in plants is primarily dissolved sugars, such as sucrose, which is table sugar. A fourth adaptation that plants have is their life cycle, alternation of generations. And this is a life cycle pattern in which a haploid stage, a multicellular haploid stage, alternates with a multicellular diploid stage. And we're going to learn this. And so on the next slide here, I'm going to draw it for us so we can become familiar with it. Now, the first thing that you need to draw, and you do need to draw this, is draw a line. And this is, no one calls it this, but Mr. Charters, that's the line of ploidy. And so above the line is diploid, 2N, below the line is haploid. Now I want you to think, because you have the knowledge to answer this question, how can you cross the line of ploidy? What biological processes will allow you to cross it? Well, if we have two haploid cells that fuse, we often call this fertilization. And so this is one of the things that I want you to write here, fertilization. Whoa, I ran out of room on my box. Over here we want to draw another box. And in here we're going to put another process. How can you go from being diploid to being haploid? Well, think of that reduction cell division. Think of meiosis. And so the line of ploidy is crossed by these two processes. Now, in this life cycle, it's really pretty easy. There's two stages. A diploid stage, up here we're going to label sporophyte. Now, at first, this might seem like a difficult name, but I think it's a very good one, better than being named after a person. Below the line, the haploid stage is called the gametophyte. Gametophyte. Let me explain about the etymology of these two names. Phyte, P-H-Y-T-E, means plant, and sporophyte produces spores, gametophyte produces gametes. Now, let's start with the first cell of the haploid gametophyte generation, and I'm going to make it right here. It's one cell, and I'm going to put in there N because it's haploid. This is a spore, and the spore will grow through mitosis into a multicellular gametophyte. So I'm going to just put here mitosis. The multicellular gametophyte through mitosis also will produce gametes. Now this isn't like in animals. Remember, animals, like a human being, is diploid and it produces haploid gametes. But this is a haploid plant stage gametophyte that's producing haploid gametes by mitosis. And so here I'm going to say that this would be an egg, and the same gametophyte could produce a sperm, and of course those two could fuse in the process of fertilization. This would produce the first cell of the diploid sporophyte generation, and what do we call a fertilized egg? That is a zygote, and the zygote will grow by mitosis into the multicellular sporophyte. Mitosis. The sporophyte will have within it special precursor cells that will undergo the process of meiosis and produce spores. And this is the life cycle, alternation of generations. Now, let's just make a couple of observations about this, make sure that you have them. Well, first of all, here's a textbook illustration. Yours is much better than this, and I'm sure you understand it, but let's make a couple of observations based on that diagram that you've drawn and hopefully learned. The gametophyte is a haploid stage that produces gametes. The sporophyte is a diploid stage that produces spores. You can change the ploidy by the two processes we started with on the line of ploidy, either fertilization or meiosis. And these same stages and processes occur in all plant life cycles. It's just which ones are dominant, how they're emphasized varies from group of plants to group of plants. So we will be learning this. With that, I think that we're going to conclude this introduction to plants. We'll start next time by talking about the features of Kingdom Plant Day, and then we'll start to go through some of the various groups of plants. Thank you for your attention.